This is the first part of a lecture on defining and organizing life for Bio 101 for August 24th, 2020. And so today's objectives are to talk about some of the properties that are shared by all living things and what constitutes something that is alive versus something non-living. And then we're also going to talk about what a phylogenetic tree shows and how we organize life, both in terms of structure and then also in terms of taxonomy, from groups that are sort of the most inclusive or the biggest to least inclusive, which are the smallest. So, what qualifies something as living versus non-living? There are several properties that apply to living things, and in order to be considered quote-unquote living, that life-defining property has to be exclusive to that particular thing, right? So all life-defining properties that we're going to talk about in the next couple slides are exclusive to living things, and in order for something to be considered alive, it has to have every single one of the following properties. The first property that all living things need to have is order or structure. So all living things are highly organized and they are made up of at least one cell. Cells are the structural and functional units of life, and so a highly organized structure of a living thing is made up of basically a highly organized structure of a bunch of cells together. Living things are also able to sense and respond to their environment or their stimuli. And so you can see here on the right a picture of a leaf that's actually responding to a stimuli of somebody touching it. And what happens is that leaf can sense the person's finger touching it and then respond accordingly by closing up all of the little smaller leaves to protect itself from potential harm. And a third property of all living things is the ability to grow or get larger, as well as reproduce or make more of themselves. And so, to summarize this slide, all living things need to have some order or an organized structure made of cells. They have to be able to sense and respond to the environment or to stimuli, and they also have to be able to grow and reproduce. That is not all. There's more properties that all living things have. The first of which is the next of which, I guess, is regulation. And so all living things need to be able to coordinate their functions, and they do that by regulating themselves. And there's one specific type of regulation that is sort of the fifth property all living things have, and that's what's known as homeostasis. And so homeostasis can be defined as sort of this steady state or an equilibrium. Or a constant internal conditions that exist regardless of what's going on outside of the living thing. And so all living things have to maintain homeostasis or maintain this steady, constant internal conditions despite whatever is going on in the outside environment. And some of the things that living things have to maintain, in particular humans, are temperature, so like body temperature, as well as water balance, how much water we have versus how much we get rid of, and pH. And so when I think about homeostasis, I think the easiest way to sort of explain the idea of this maintenance of a constant environment is to think about when you're in the shower and how there's one particularly wonderful temperature of water, and everybody's got their sort of perfect temperature, right? This ideal internal condition or this ideal temperature condition. And the longer the time that you spend in the shower, that temperature might fluctuate, right? And that's the environment changing. And so sometimes the water will get slightly less cold. You're running out of hot water and you have to adjust that thermostat up to make it warmer to that ideal temperature again. Sometimes somebody will flush the toilet somewhere and the water will scald you really quickly, and you'll have to quickly turn down the faucet to adjust back to the perfect temperature. And so homeostasis and regulation kind of work together to do that inside of our body. There are these constant small little tweaks that your body is making without you knowing to maintain kind of that ideal perfect condition despite whatever is going on outside. In addition to those properties, all living things also have to be able to adapt or to change to fit different environmental conditions. And this occurs through a process called natural selection. This change is generally known as evolution, and natural selection is responsible for that evolution. And we're going to talk more about that later in another lecture. But that ability to change and respond to your changes in your environment is an important property that all living things share. And finally, the last property all living things have is the ability to process energy. So all of this stuff, growing and reproducing, responding to stimuli, adapting, maintaining homeostasis, requires some kind of energy or some kind of metabolism to power all of these different processes. And so energy processing is sort of the last and pretty important property that a living thing has. And so I wanted you to take a moment and sort of think about all of these different properties, right? So all living things have to have order. They have to be structured. They have to be able to respond to stimuli and sense it. They have to be able to grow, to reproduce, to maintain that steady homeostasis, adapt and change in response to the environment, and process energy. And so as you look through this list, I want you to pause the video and take a second and think about if computers have any of these properties. And then which ones that they might or might not have, right? To think about whether or not computers are actually alive. And so, as you probably have noted, computers do have some of these properties, right? Computers are highly ordered. They have the ability to respond to a stimuli. So when you press on the keys of a keyboard, stuff happens. They can use energy, and they require it to do all their work. And they can even kind of respond in some ways to change and maintain their sort of internal environment as well. One thing that computers cannot do is grow or reproduce. And so that one life-sustaining property of growth and reproduction means that, and the fact that computers lack it, means that computers are not actually alive. And technically, they don't have quite the ability to respond to stimuli or adapt as other living organisms do, right? Because if you throw your computer in a bathtub, it's not going to be able to adapt to that situation. It's going to die. And so when computers can ultimately grow, reproduce, and adapt, they would technically be considered alive, but until that point, they're just really helpful tools that we use, but they remain non-living. And this is just to illustrate that in order for something to be alive, it has to have all of these different things.